He had run out of options. The only thing between his son and the unknown was the authority of one woman in a white coat. The ambulance doors had slammed, and the fluorescent light had poured into Daniel Cole's face like a verdict. He carried his boy on his chest with the mechanical tenderness of someone who had practiced holding a fragile thing for too long. Blood had darkened a jacket sleeve, then clotted into the cuff. A thin, faded blue handkerchief bulged from his back pocket, its tiny yellow flowers dulled by years of washing and weather. When he set his son on the gurney, his hands trembled less from the weight of the boy and more from the history that tugged at him from that square of cloth. The corridor smelled of antiseptic and something like waiting, that gray patience people wear in hospitals when you can neither act nor rest. Nurses moved through the corridor with the sharp choreography of habit. A monitor hummed behind the treatment door. Somewhere, a pager barked. Daniel's daughter stood against the wall, knees hugged to her chest, crayon drawing clutched like a talisman. It was a simple thing, a stick-figure family beneath a circular sun, the boy in the middle with a cape of blue scribbled over his shoulders. Ella's lower lip was open, as if she had been ready to speak but had given up on the grammar of impossible words. They pushed the gurney through to a bay. A triage nurse took quick stock, murmured medical phrases like prayers, and called for the chief. Daniel did not recognize the names or the equipment. He recognized only the urgency, and within it a familiar low principle, the single, raw demand to do whatever it takes. Weeks earlier and years before would not have seemed connected. When he wasn't hauling a second-shift tray of dishes or patching mattresses in the night, Daniel Cole moved through the world measured and small. He lived in the gray hours between jobs, where the city's edges frayed and the day was just beginning to be forgiving. He carried his grief light and hidden, in the way a man keeps a scar under his collar, private and steady. The handkerchief had been a fragment of that past, a borrowed relic from a promise he had made, and an emblem of an absence he could not speak aloud. He kept it folded in his pocket the way some people carry rosaries, fingers threading the fabric when sleep refused to come. It smelled faintly of oil and bleach and the loneliness of motel rooms. Ella had been born after the war, after the long rearrangement of his life. She had brought into his house a small, stubborn kind of cheer, mismatched socks, a tendency to cut paper into confetti, a habit of leaving crayon drawings in his coat pockets. She needed him the way a compass needs north. He did not pretend to be heroic, only dependable. He learned to tell time by the rhythm of her breathing and the way the kitchen light looked at 7:30. The boy on the gurney had been his other child, bruised and still waiting to be named by daylight. The name and the future blurred into an ache that the handkerchief could not solve. In the bay, people moved with purpose that had no room for pleading. Doctors exchanged clipped notes. A medical student adjusted a line. A respiratory therapist checked a tube. Daniel hovered at the edge like a shadow, saying fragments. Please, just. The nurse put a palm on his shoulder, steady, neither stopping him nor inviting him in. He found himself repeating the single request he had rehearsed in the ambulance and then again standing in the corridor. I need to speak to the chief doctor. Triage took a breath that could have been a dismissal. We can't update you until... I have to speak to her now, Daniel said. There was no posture of entitlement in him. There was no swagger of those who think institutions exist to serve them. Only a dogged, naked urgency. He's my son. The nurse's eyes moved over him, a man with creased knuckles, skin brittle from long hours outdoors. A veteran square in his bearing, though he didn't wear his service like a banner. The handkerchief slipped from his pocket as he gestured, a faded blue square tumbling onto the linoleum. There are small, quiet things that break a room. A dropped object becomes a punctuation mark. The handkerchief fell and unspooled a memory in those who watched. A little patchwork of color that contradicted the sterile white of everything else. It landed by the gurney, its fabric settling into a shape like an old conversation. The chief doctor came down the corridor with the authority of someone who had learned to measure life in rational terms and human ones at once. She moved with the economy of a person who could not waste motion. Her coat had the faint smudge of a night's work and one careful crease in the lapel. There was a thin scar under her collarbone that showed at the neckline when she turned to catch the nurse's report, a pale line that suggested an old wound healed into history. Her hair was streaked at the temple, and when she stepped into light, the light did not soften her. It revealed her, focused, exacting, the kind of person who could pronounce the boundaries between possible and impossible without ceremony. Daniel went to her before she had finished. He did not stumble through the sentences that many people do. He barreled the truth forward like a man stripping himself of armor. "Doctor, please, I need you to save him. I'll pay, I'll do anything." He nearly bowed, not to the woman, but to the possibility that someone could bend what the rest of the world called fate. She listened, and the listening had its own gravity. Her hands did not fidget, her face did not betray surprise. She asked one question. "What's his name?" The boy's name filled her space. It hung in the air, a syllable that proved a person. Her eyes, for a sliver of a second, softened as if she had been offered a human scale with which to judge a complicated problem. Then she went to the chart, scanning lines of numbers and colors and faint handwriting. The medical decisions she made for a living required that she translate human pleas into clinical terms and probabilities. She did not pretend the translation was simple. Outside the cluster of staff and machines, the waiting room arranged itself into a chorus of low sounds. The sighs of exhausted relatives, the sharp laughter of a visiting nurse trying to break the edge, the small, steady footstep of a tired man on a late shift. People had been drawn by curiosity as much as sympathy, the human impulse to witness a crisis. Some watched Daniel with the reflexive coldness of those who have become desensitized. Others watched with something like hunger for a tidy moral. The rich help, the poor are forgiven, a hero steps forward. None of them knew the weight that had been folded into the faded blue square on the floor. Daniel's plea stalled between the definitive medical terms the doctor considered and the private grammar of his life. He began to tell her things he had never planned to say aloud, about nights on a barracks cot, about a man who once laughed too loudly for how bad things were, about a promise he had made to a brother-in-arms to carry a token home if the world allowed it. He admitted the old truth. He had been there when Michael had fallen. He had tried and failed, and since then had kept a piece of that friendship pressed to his ribs. The chief's face did not alter at the confession. She was not a woman who processed grief as theater. She measured it. A nurse moved to close a door and then freed it as if it were an act of discretion. The child's drawing forgot to be a child's drawing and became an artifact. The boy beneath the blue cape looked defiant and teetering at once. Daniel folded his hands around nothing and said, softer than a question, "I need to know I'm doing everything. If there's a chance?" He waited for the kind of answer that splits a decision in two. Her eyes moved toward the gurney, to monitors, to numbers that were not human enough to hold a child's laugh. He read the promise in her jawline. She would tell him the truth. He braced, the way a man bracing for a storm tightens against his coat. Then the handkerchief pulled the world. It had landed beside the gurney and behind the commotion of machines and the practiced calm of the staff. A current of air from a passing orderly lifted it, and the square skittered across the floor closer to her foot. She stooped without thinking, a professional reflex or a private courtesy, and when her fingers brushed the fabric, there was a pause so small and so precise that it registered as a crack in the air. She set the fabric on the top of a clipboard. The pattern, the small yellow flowers against the faded blue, were the kind of domestic details that carry lineage. Something in her face shifted like a gate turning. For the first time that night, she seemed younger, as if the contours of past and present slid against each other under her skin. There was recognition, quick and clinical, and then personal, like a physician identifying a rare sign that a normal test would miss. She looked at Daniel, and the room narrowed itself to that look. Her answering sentence dropped like a small stone into a deep well. It made the air tremble. "You were with Michael when he died." The sentence struck with the bluntness of a verdict. It carried no accusation in its grammar, only fact, a naming that rearranged all the small furniture of Daniel's inner rooms. It did what a single sentence can do in a life lived in fragments. It reunited him with a moment of self he had spent years avoiding. Where he had kept his guilt private, it was now public, visible in his posture, in the way his shoulders curved to carry blame like a backpack. He felt himself fracture in a way he had learned to hide in the dark. The sound of the monitor hummed, and his heartbeat translated the single line into an echo. The memory of the field, the smoke, the hands that had reached and failed. Everything slid inside him. He remembered being 22 and filthy, and the odd, terrible intimacy of two men laughing in the face of fear. He remembered Michael slipping in a ditch and the absurd business of trying to lift him out under a sky that refused to be kind. He remembered the handkerchief. Michael had carried a similar square, pressed like a moth-eaten flag into the pocket of his uniform, and Daniel had taken up to preserve it somewhere between honoring and shame. That night had been a knot he had not untied. The chief sentence was the hand that set down the compass and pointed directly at it. There was a long silence. The staff moved as if the air had thickened. The waiting room turned inward, as if something private had become public property. In that silence, Daniel felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the boy bleeding on the gurney. He had begged for a surgeon's scalpel and found instead an incision into his past. He wanted to apologize, to explain the sliver between acts and consequences. Instead, his lips shaped the warmest of confessions. I tried. We tried. I couldn't." The words swamped and ran dry. The boy's small hand twitched against the sheet, and Ella buried her face into her knees like that would make the world less loud. The doctor listened. The one sentence had done its work, but the night would not allow a neat closure. She had dispensed a truth. Now she did what those who have to move through moral complexity do next. She let the quiet keep its shape until Daniel could stand within it rather than be consumed by it. That pause was an act of authority and of mercy both, a refusal to dismiss the man into a stereotype and a refusal to make the past an unanswerable sentence. When she spoke again, it was not the blunt naming that had broken him. It was softer, and in it there was a recognition that they were more than the roles they had been handed by the world. "You carried that all these years," she said, not accusing but stating. "And you brought him here." It was a sentence that would not absolve, and it was not meant to. It was the kind of thing that could be a beginning, not of forgetting, but of being held accountable in the presence of people who could still choose what to do. He stepped back as if the words had weight. "I deserve it," he said. The admission was an effort of will. For a moment, his entire body was that confession. It would have been easy, in a room full of strangers, to bow to the narrative he had so often rehearsed. The soldier with blood on his hands, the father with debt to fate. Daniel refused to be reduced to that. He squared himself and asked, hoarse, "Will you help my son?" The chief doctor considered the charts again. She spoke with clinical plainness that might have been a kindness. "We will do what we can. There are limits, but I will put this into the hands of my team." Even as she said it, Daniel felt the earlier sentence, "You were with Michael when he died," settle into him like a stone. It did not make the medical facts any more hopeful. It did not clothe them in miracle. But in the space between her words there was something else, a recognition he had not expected and could not have asked for. The woman's knowledge of his past had stripped away pretense. It had made the plea he had offered more than a transactional request. It was now part of a ledger of obligations he had accrued and others might choose to meet. Outside, those who had watched shifted. Some lowered their eyes. Others found, in the exchange between man and doctor, an inconvenient complexity. A couple near the window glanced at one another with the sudden shame of people who had judged too quickly. A nurse, who had seen things bend and break in other rooms, sat down in the corridor and pressed her forehead with a practiced exhaustion that was almost prayer. The chief doctor turned back to the gurney. "We need blood work and CT," she said. "Prepare for possible operation. I want anesthesiology on standby." She moved with the authority that comes from years of practice and hard choices. People around her read the medical directives as if they were offering a promise, not of cure, but of effort. Daniel felt a cautious, terrible hope flare, like a small flame in a winter window. He followed the team as they wheeled his son down the corridor, the handkerchief still folded atop the clipboard like a relic someone had forgotten to pick up. In the corridor outside the operating suite, words diminished into a different language. Machines, time, vital signs. Daniel sat hunched in a chair with Ella edging closer to him, the child's drawing now unfolded across his knees. He watched the door to the operating room as if it were a shutter that could hide a storm. His mind traveled back in time to that battlefield, the wind, the metallic tang of fear, Michael's laugh, and it ran against the present like two currents colliding. He had not realized that the guilty part of him had preferred being alone. Shame is a private thing because public exposure makes it worse. At some point, the chief doctor returned and sat down opposite him. The lighting in the corridor softened in the small pool by the bench, and in that softer light he could see the fine lines at the edge of her eyes. She removed her coat and placed it over the back of the chair, not quite folding it the way some people fold who need to be in control. She did not ask him to recount the battlefield events. She had named them, and that naming did a strange thing. It allowed space for truth. "I should tell you something," she said. Her voice had the steady tone of a professional, but there was an undercurrent, an honesty that felt like someone admitting a perpetuated wrong. "Michael was my brother." The information was a cord cut taut. He had guessed, he had feared, and still he was unprepared for the human shape of the thing. Michael as my brother was no longer an abstraction of self-reproach. He was kin. The truth settled into the space between the two and altered their responsibilities to one another. "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" Daniel asked, the words cheap and small in his mouth. "I didn't want anything to be asked of me," she said simply. "I didn't want debt to be traded. I thought if I kept him only as memory, I could manage it. But tonight—" She sighed and touched the handkerchief as if the fabric itself had an answer. "Tonight, seeing him, your son, has forced a different calculus." He wanted to flinch away from that calculus. The knowledge that he had been carrying her brother's death alone had been a private crucifix. The acknowledgement made it communal. Shame, made public, can either be a spectacle or a turning point. In that corridor, their embarrassment folded into a shared history. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, a phrase that had followed him through the years like a worn coin. I was supposed to. Save him, she finished for him. Her voice was not accusation. It was the matter-of-fact articulation of a wound they both recognized. The doctor stood and reached into her pocket, as if to draw courage the way one might draw tissue. She placed a hand on his wrist. The touch was quick and not performative, the kind that verifies a pulse in someone else's world. I won't judge you beyond what happened. We will treat your son as a child, not as a ledger. There was a righteous, small kindness in this that moved some of the air from his chest. He had expected censure, maybe even a choice to be made that he would have no right to influence. Instead, she gave him the workmanlike compassion of a person who sees moral complexity and refuses to weaponize it. It did not erase the sentence she'd spoken. It reframed it into the start of an account that could be balanced by action rather than punished by shame. The operation took hours, measured by the slow crawl of the clock, by the gestures of surgeons in the doorframe, by the way Ella dozed on his shoulder and left a smear of crayon wax against his wrist. The waiting room dimmed into an umber of waiting faces who had their own small tragedies. Every time the operating room door opened, the world held its breath, like someone at a poolside waiting for a diver to break the surface. When the chief doctor came out at last, the weight of her face was something he could read without a medical degree. Her eyes had that mixture of professional gravity and the fragile tenderness of someone who had spent her life learning what could be mended and what could not. She sat a step away and removed her gloves slowly. "We did what we could," she said. "There were complications. We stabilized him for now, but there are going to be more tests, more days. I can't promise you full recovery, but he's alive, and the next days will tell us what is possible." Her answer cracked him anew, not with the old shame, but with a portrait of the precariousness of hope. Living, painfully, was not the same as being spared future loss. It invited a different kind of courage, possibility mixed with practical dread. Daniel steadied his hands. He did not demand miracles anymore. He learned to ask for presence. Is he going to be in pain? "We will manage his pain," she said. "We will keep him comfortable, and we will do everything within the scope of what medicine can offer. But tonight, he needs you to be present, not to bear the burden alone again." When she said "not alone again," the words bent his world. She did not mean to rescue him from guilt. She meant that the ledger he had carried need not be balanced by isolating himself under a heap of remorse. Michael's death would still be a part of him, but it would not be what defined every single decision he made thereafter. Outside the operating suite, there was an odd small ritual. The chief doctor handed him back the handkerchief, folded now a piece of evidence rather than a relic. Daniel did not take it at first. It felt like an act of penance. But he reached out and accepted it, fingers fumbling around the edges. The fabric smelled like the night and the detergent of the hospital, but to him it smelled like the seam of his life being repaired in some minuscule way. Life in the hours that followed was a mosaic of banalities and intense tenderness. Ella drew on a hospital napkin, the blue cape now given color with a new stroke. Daniel sat beside the plastic crib and whispered the stories he had never told his children about small braveries and ridiculous laughter and the smell of cordite. Stories that had been half shame and half tribute, now offered as honest narrative. The chief doctor came twice to check on the boy's IVs and once to stand at the foot of the bed and watch the child's small chest rise and fall. There were no grand speeches. There were glances and repeated, practical kindnesses. News, as it does, gathered people. The ward had its own economy of attention. Nurses who had once been brusque became softer in the presence of the children who threaded through the hallways. The weight of being seen, of being held in the gaze of someone who knew your failings and chose to act, changed the tenor of the waiting room. One of the men who had earlier watched Daniel with a smirk found himself folding his hands in his lap and moving toward him with a bottle of coffee and the awkward improvisation of condolences. The story of a veteran with a faded handkerchief and a child in danger did not become easy. It did not wrap itself in closure, but it threaded through people the fragile recognition that human lives accumulate mistakes and attempts at repair together. The chief doctor did not lecture Daniel about his past. She simply kept doing her work and, in quiet ways, made space for him to be whole in the imperfect way a hospital lets people be whole, through stitches, through medicine, and through company. Days later, there was a moment that felt like a hinge. The boy was awake and blinking and looking smaller than he had in the night. He reached for his crayon drawing with a thin, starved hand and grinned. Daniel sat on the side of the bed and drifted toward something like relief, a slow thaw. The chief doctor came in and stood by the window where the morning light came pale and clean. She watched the boy and then met Daniel's gaze. The old scar at her collarbone caught the sun and flashed like a sign. "There's something else," she said quietly, as if sharing a private map. "I spent years wanting someone to pay for what happened. I shaped my anger into a tool so I wouldn't break under it. But holding on to that proved less like justice and more like a cage. Seeing you tonight, the way you stayed, the way you couldn't leave, made me remember that some deaths are repaid not by punishment, but by bearing witness." Daniel had not expected to be a witness of anything beyond his son's recovery. He felt the shape of his own relief like an uncertain tide. "I never meant to be anything but his father," he said. "I thought I could atone in silence. I thought—" She interrupted him without rancor. "We all thought different things. What matters is now. You brought him here. You stayed. That matters." Words in a corridor can make a life change gear. The chief doctor did not promise absolution in a religious sense, nor did she demand an apology like a currency. She offered instead a human appraisal, a reading of character that carried weight because it was true. In the months after, when they both went back into the daily tasks of their lives, her to operating rooms and conferences, him to shifts and daughter's school concerts, their paths bent toward one another with a new kind of recognition. They were, in a way, two people who had been measured by loss and decided to keep choosing life. Later, when the boy was discharged with a small, awkward packet of instructions and prescriptions and the late green light of the hospital sign behind them, Daniel folded the handkerchief and slipped it back into his pocket in the same place as always. It no longer felt like a heavy relic of guilt. It was a reminder of Michael, of those who had been lost, and of the fragile human arrangement where mistakes exist alongside acts of care. On the edge of the parking lot, Ella took his hand and pressed the crayon drawing into his palm. "For luck," she said, solemn as a child who believes drawing can rearrange the future. The cape had been redrawn with steadier lines. He looked at his son's small, bandaged hand, then at the pile of people in the glowing hospital doors. Nurses moving like tides, the chief doctor, a figure who had cut a clean path through his shame, and he let the moment wash over him. He had not been saved from the consequences of his past. He had not been offered an easy absolution. But something had shifted. Public knowledge of a private wound, met with care rather than a cudgel, had opened a different way forward. He felt less alone in the ledger of his life. As they drove home, the city passing like a slow film, the handkerchief was a small, familiar weight against his thigh. The boy slept in the back seat, steady and breathing, the blue cape in his mind's drawings perhaps now becoming a small fact in a life that would, inevitably, have more days than nights. He did not know what grace was precisely, or whether the term applied to ordinary transactions of human life. He only knew a small set of truths, that being seen can be more shattering than being physically hurt, and that sometimes a single sentence can both break you and open a door. He knew, too, that the chief doctor had given him a sentence that was true and necessary, and that in the aftermath of it he had found not rescission of guilt, but a way to hold it without letting it crush him. Later, long after the hospital night had become a memory with the porous edges of old dreams, Daniel would fold the handkerchief with the ritual of someone tucking away an heirloom. He would tell the story in fragments to his children, not to make them burdened with his regrets, but to make them aware that people are complicated, and that choosing to stand with another person rather than walking away is one of the simplest, bravest things any of us can do. The chief doctor's answer had shattered him. It had forced him to encounter a life he had been avoiding, the person he had been in the smoke, the friend whose death he had never properly mourned. But from that break came other fragments that could be assembled into a different shape. People in the waiting room would remember the way the staff had moved. Ella would always keep a drawing in her pocket. The boy would grow up with a father who had learned the cost of silence and the value of presence. That night had not simplified a complicated past into a neat moral. It had instead opened a difficult conversation between the cost of memory and the responsibility of the present. The chief doctor had spoken a sentence that detonated a private prison and left behind in the quiet dust the slow scaffolding of repair.